Good afternoon and welcome to the third in a series of webinars on identity by Condatis. This webinar will last for around 30 to 40 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session. My name is Rob Gathergood. I'm a business analyst and will be joined today by Dave Downs, one of our senior developers here at Condatis. We are specialists in identity and access management. We're a Microsoft Gold partner and support organizations in creating seamless user journeys with Azure Active Directory. For those of you who missed our previous webinars, you can find these on our website and our YouTube channel. Our first webinar gives an introduction to Microsoft Azure Active Directory B2C and its identity and access management capabilities. So if you're new to identity or to B2C, we'd recommend starting with that webinar first. Our second webinar focused on customizing user journeys with B2C. Here, Dave demonstrated how to configure sign-up and sign-in policies, how to apply your own branding, how to deploy policies, and how to onboard applications which use different identity protocols, giving examples using both OIDC and SAML protocols. You can find both these webinars on our website and on YouTube. We'll also make the slides for this webinar available at the end of today's session. Following from the last webinar around customizing user journeys, this webinar will cover single sign-on with users being able to access multiple different applications using the same sign-in session. We'll look at how session handling can be managed. We'll give examples of how to incorporate federation using both Active Directory and social sign-on via Google and Facebook. And finally, we'll demonstrate how multi-factor authentication can be used during your user journeys. If you do have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A chat in Teams. I'll now pass over to Dave, who's going to give us the demo on how to federate the sign-in process.
Cool, thanks Rob. Yeah, there's going to be a few different topics today, so we'll try and touch on each of them in a bit of depth. And if there's any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat or get in touch with us afterwards if you've got anything a bit more specific. So let's drop out into a demo. So last time in the previous webinar, we talked through setting up the OpenID Connect site, setting up the SAML site, and then using single sign-on to kind of manage your session between them. So if I sign into my OpenID Connect site using my demo account from last time, sign me in, I get my token back with all my claims, I can then go to my SAML site, click sign in over there, and it just goes straight through the process. No need to reprompt me, just gives me a new token with the SAML specific details in. Now that's fine as a first step. We can make it a bit more seamless for the user by having something like a portal site or a dashboard site. So we'll show that just very briefly. If I sign out of over here, it just automatically signs me out of there. So what I've done is I've now set up another site that just again uses B2C, uses the same policies that we were using before, uses all the same logic. We sign into that. So with my password. And that gives us these two options that I've added, one for accessing our OpenID Connect site and one for accessing our SAML site. So if I open up my OpenID Connect site now, I'm still not signed in, the same as I wasn't for my SAML site. But what I can do is in my portal, if I click my button, that takes me over to my OpenID Connect site where I get automatically signed in. And you see if I refresh over here, I'm now signed into every tab, every instance of that. All we're doing there in our portal site is having our user sent to the sign-in link for our OpenID Connect site, which redirects over to B2C, does all of our single sign-on juice that we've already gone through and set up for our portal, signs the user straight in, sends them back to the OpenID Connect site in a signed-in state. So to the user, it's like they're accessing all of the same site, even though they're actually different ones, and it's done through this single sign-on session. So how does that session actually work? How are we configuring it to do this, to do the logic behind it? So if I sign out of everywhere, so I'm now signed out. So if you remember, when we do the sign in, we're just defining each of these pages as technical profiles in the policy. So we start with our sign in page here, which is just a page, a technical profile that we've defined in our policy. We're capturing an email, we're capturing a password, and then once the user's been authenticated, we're returning their object ID, their unique user ID, back out, their name, surname, full name, all of which goes into the token later on. If they do a registration, we're doing the same thing. So when I click on sign up now, we've defined a technical profile that defines this page. We want to capture the email address, passwords, names, etc. And again, we get an object ID out once we've created the user on the directory. You can see on both of these that we've got a particular element defined as part of the technical profile called Use Technical Profile for Session Management. And we've set that to be the SMAAD technical profile. So we've just set up another technical profile that's responsible for handling the session. And we link that to both the sign-in page through this Use Technical Profile for Session Management and the registration page through exactly the same thing. So what's that actually doing? If I go up to my extensions policy, so remember this policy, the extensions one, is available to all of the different user journey policies that we're using. We've got a hierarchy going on here where we have our user journey, we have all of the components for our user journey, and then we have all of the components for all of the user journeys that we might have. So we've got set up in that wide-reaching one, this SMAAD technical profile, which we've defined as a type of default SSO session provider, which is basically just saying to B2C, this session management technical profile is dealing with the single sign-on session. And we're saying that as part of that, we want to save some claims to the session. And the important one here is the fact that we're saving the object ID. So whenever we say we want to use this SMAAD technical profile for session management, B2C is going to reference it and read and write the object ID from it and any single sign-on session logic specific to B2C. So if I go back to my sign-in page, so if we go to our journey and let's step through step by step and see what we're going to be doing with the session and how that affects what we're showing on the page, what steps we're executing. So if you remember, our user journey starts with step 1, which is us showing this sign-in page, which is just referencing that technical profile that defines the sign-in page, which itself is referencing the technical profile that defines how we're managing the session. So the first time through, we don't have a session. There's nothing for B2C to do here. So we just enter our details. When I click sign in, that's going to authenticate my user against the directory, trigger our session technical profile, which is going to save our object ID, freshly read from the directory through my authentication, to the session. We'll go to step 2, the same as we were doing last time. Now step 2, we still have the object ID because we've signed the user in, so we know it's not a registration, we know we've got a user, we can skip over step 2. Step 3, we read the user from the directory by that ID, populate any of their details, we were populating the custom referrer field before finally, step 4, we package all of that up into a token, send it on to the relying party. If we were doing a registration, it'd be largely the same. So step 1, we're not doing a sign in, so it doesn't execute that. It just renders the page, but doesn't sign the user in. Step 2, we don't have an object ID, so it'd show the registration page. At that point, the session would kick in. Once it's created the user, we've posted the details back. Session kicks in, stores our object ID. Step 3, again, read the user from the directory just to make sure we've got everything. Step 4, issue a token. So sign in. So we've read the user, we've issued a token, we've signed in. Now, if we were to sign in again, what's B2C going to do this time? It's still going to execute step 1 because there's no preconditions on that. It's still the first step. So it still knows that it needs to execute the sign-in page, but it also knows that it's linked to our single sign-on technical profile. Because we're using the single sign-on session provider, B2C knows that we just use a local account to sign in, so it doesn't need to re-prompt us for that username and password. It knows that we're already using that as the authentication source. So it just uses the session to read the object ID. It takes the object ID out of the session, the one that we're storing. It skips over step 1, because it doesn't need to redo the username and password sign-in. Step 2, we've got an object ID. It's the one we've just read out of the session. So we know we're not doing a user registration, so we skip over that. Step 3, now all we've got here, because we've not actually done an authentication yet, is that user ID, that object ID. So we use the read by user ID to read all the details for the user from the directory based on that object ID. And then step 4, we issue the token. So step 1, B2C knows, because of the session provider we're using, that it doesn't need to do another sign-in, that it can just read the object ID from the session. Step 2, we've got an object ID, so we don't do that. Step 3, we use that object ID from the session to read everything from the directory, so we get a full token back. And then step 4, we package that all up as an actual token, send it on to the relying party. So by combining all of those different things, by combining our single sign-on session provider technical profile with the technical profiles that define our pages, so we can say where we want to use the session, with our user journey steps and our preconditions, complex logic that all works because of just how we configured it and the logic that comes built into B2C. One thing that we have done that we maybe don't need to do or might want to do differently is set the scope of the single sign-on. So at the moment, we've set the scope to be at the tenant level, which you've seen from the fact that we can sign into any of our sites just by signing into one of them. When the scope's at the tenant level, no matter where you sign in from, B2C keeps track of a single user session, and it will reuse that user session for all of your applications, for all of your policies. Now, what we could do is we could restrict that a bit. We could set the scope to the policy level, and that'd mean that for each policy that an application is using to sign in, there'd be a different user session. So our OpenID Connect site and our dashboard, where they both use this sign-in policy, they both have the same user session. So if I sign into one, I can seamlessly sign into the other. Because our SAML site uses a different policy, my user session wouldn't carry over, so I'd be prompted to sign in again. Similarly, we can set the scope to application. So there, where before when it was policy, our two applications, our OpenID Connect and our dashboard, were both sharing the same user session. Now, if we set it to application, there won't be. Each one will have its own user session, so I'll be re-prompted to sign in every time. So we can make the scope quite granular and different depending on the policies that are being used, depending on the applications that are being used. And that's really a summary and overview of how the session works, how it all hangs together. There's more types of session, there's more complicated ways you can use the session than that, but we're not really going to cover them here. It's all fully documented on the Microsoft Doc site, or feel free to get in touch with us if you've got any questions about it or you want to go through with it. It's usually used for things like federation and social signing and keeping track of that, or SAML sign-ins, that kind of thing. So for now, what we'll do is we'll just go on to a demonstration of how federation itself works. And for that, we're going to change our journey slightly. So I'm going to sign out of here and I'm going to check out a new set of policies. So I'll my homegrown ones, and then I want to upload them to B2C. So we showed last time uploading policy files to B2C through the Azure portal, just uploading them one by one, doing file uploads. This tool just allows us to upload them from the command line in bulk using Graph API. So I've got a new set of policies. We're still using some of the logic from our first set of policies for doing the local sign-in, but what we want to do now is we want to provide the option for our staff members to sign in, as well as for our customers to sign in. And we want to do that by detecting the email address that the user's using to sign in. And if it's a company email address, we want to send them to our AAD. If it's not, then we want to send them just into the local login, the local sign-in, local registration, like we've been doing so far. So, sign in now. We've now got a new screen, this home realm discovery screen. All we're doing here is capturing the email address, and then running some logic in the policy to determine whether it's a local address or a company address. Now, you can see here, step 1 is now this home realm discovery step. And again, we're just executing a technical profile that defines what this page is, and based on the email address that we're inputting, what logic to run to populate another claim, IDP, with either the value local, if we think that it's a local user trying to do a sign-in, or company, if we think it's a staff member that we want to federate off to our AAD. In this case, I've entered my company address, so my home realm discovery technical profile knows that that's a company address. It knows to do the federation. So step 2, we check the result of me clicking continue on this step, which I'll do in a minute. If it's local, we'll execute the local sign-in. It isn't, so we skip over, just like we were doing with our registration. Step 3, if it's company, we're going to execute this step. We want to do a company sign-in, so continue. So all we've done there is execute our company sign-in technical profile. So if we go take a quick look at that, our company sign-in is just another technical profile that we've defined as one of our sign-in components, and we've set it up as an OpenID Connect technical profile with a bunch of details about where it should go to get metadata, how to identify B2C as an application, and what we're sending over to AAD to identify the user, and what we're expecting back from AAD. So all that's happening here is, like our application used OpenID Connect to federate to B2C, B2C is now using OpenID Connect to federate to AAD. Our relying party doesn't need to know that we've gone anywhere near AAD. It doesn't care. It trusts B2C to do the authentication, and then B2C trusts our AAD to do the authentication. Our AAD does the authentication, returns details to B2C. B2C does some verification automatically, pulls out the details it needs, and then returns its own token back to the relying party. This goes all the way back to webinar 1, where we talked about those chains of trust and being able to federate down the chain to different relying parties or different identity providers without needing any earlier part of the chain really to know about the later parts. So I'm in my AAD. We know that I'm Dave Downs at sitekit.net because I've passed in my email address. So I go through whatever requirements my admin requires. So in this case, I need to grab my password from my password manager. So I might need to do MFA here. I might be prompted for passwordless. Entirely depends on what my AAD is set up for. I sign in. Don't want to say signed in. No. So AAD returned a token back to here to B2C. B2C then continued on with its journey. So step 4, we do some session stuff we don't really care about for this purpose. Step 5, it generates its own token, sends it back to my relying party, and you can see here this looks just like we had before, except now I've got this different display name, which is just, it's coming from my AAD like that. I've set that as literally my name in my AAD. And we've added an authentication source of federated authentication just so that we can see here B2C made a choice, and we can reflect that at the end if we need to. We don't have to include this claim. Again, we're entirely in control of the token. So down here where we defined authentication source, we don't have to. We could remove that. It's purely for demonstration purposes. So what about if I'm a local user now? So if I sign out, so we're still going to do step 1. So back we go, home realm discovery. So I do continue. So again, we're just executing that home realm discovery technical profile. And we go to our local sign-in page. So we did step 1. It figured out what should be in this IDP claim. In this case, it's local. If it's local, we don't skip over step 2. So here, what we've actually got now is we're invoking a subjourney. So all I've done, rather than have several different steps like we did before for the local sign-in, I've kind of collated them all together, wrapped them all up into their own little mini journey that I can execute from this wider journey. So we go and we do what we've labeled a local sign-in. So down here, my local sign-in subjourney, you can see, is exactly what we had when we were just doing only the local sign-in. Step 1's our sign-in, step 2 is our conditional registration, step 3 is the read user, at which point we come back into our main journey. Step 3 of our main journey, we're not doing a company sign-in, so we're going to skip that. We're not doing a company sign-in, so we're going to skip the company sign-in session, and then we issue the token. So if I go password, sign in, and we're through. Exactly the same as we were when we were doing our local sign-in. Effectively, from B2C's point of view, all we've done here is execute step 1, home realm discovery, execute step 2, which was our longer little local sign-in, skip over step 3 and 4, and then return a token to the user. You can see now we're generating a new authentication source of local authentication just to show we went down that different journey path. Now we're using home realm discovery here. That's one way of doing it. We don't have to do it that way. We could have different policies depending on how we want to do it. One for staff sign-in, one for local sign-in. We could pass in the information to the policy that we want to sign a staff member in or we want to sign a local account in. So we don't have to do home realm discovery. We just pull some information from the request, and then based on that, we populate maybe the IDP claim or we do some other different logic. We can also add our AAD as a selection when we're doing the local sign-in. So we'll come to that in a minute when we do social sign-in, but we can just surface it as another button that the user can click to do a sign-in. There's several different ways of setting this up, several different ways of funneling the user through their journey. It doesn't have to be that we've just got this home realm discovery page and then we've got the sign-in and so on. We've got a lot of control over how we do it. So, speaking about local sign-in, what does that look like? If we check out another set of policies. So this again, it's going to make use of federation again, but it's a different way of doing it, a different kind, which allows us to sign users in using Google and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all the rest of those. So I check out a new set of policies. So let's sign out again. So if we look at our main journey here, nothing's changed. So we're still doing our home realm discovery. We're still going to our local sign-in if it's a local user. We're still doing our federation off to AAD if it's a company user with the associated session, and we're still generating the token. What we've changed is our local sign-in, how we're actually authenticating our local users. So if I go to my little sub journey down here, you'll see this has now got a lot more fleshed out. So we've still got step 1, which is our combined sign in and sign up. And if I go into this and show you, so we still go through to the local account sign-in page, but we've now got these additional claims provider selections. We can now select to do a Google sign-in, to do a Facebook sign-in. We've set up down here what happens when the user clicks those different buttons. So where before we only had either login or registration, now we've got login, or if the user hasn't logged in, did they choose to do a Google sign-in, did they choose to do a Facebook sign-in, or did they choose to do a registration, based on which button they're clicking. And the fact that I've filled these in here dictates what this page is going to contain. Now again, we've applied custom styling to this page, so this Google and Facebook button look like this and are in this position because of how I've set up the custom styling. We've got a lot of control there as well about how that's displayed on the page, whether we show these as the more heavily styled, Google image Facebook, the Facebook image, the LinkedIn image, it's entirely down to us. We can control all of that using the regular HTML and CSS and JavaScript. All we're doing here is just setting them up, doing some basic styling to kind of show the possibilities. So when I click on Google or Facebook, or if I had others clicked on those, we're going to execute step 1. We haven't done a sign-in, so we go to step 2. We don't have an object ID because we didn't do a sign-in, so we execute something on step 2. B2C maps back to whichever one I selected. So in this case, we'll say I'm going to click Google. So it executes the Google sign-in technical profile, which, like we had with our AAD one, is just a technical profile that says, go off to Google to sign in. Once you're done, it comes back, it verifies the token, pulls some details out of it. I'm going to do whatever I need to do in Google to authenticate, which we'll go through in a moment. Once that's happened, we'll go on to step 3 and step 4, which are about making sure that when we've signed in with Google and Facebook, we've got a user in the directory. So if I sign in with my Google account, So grab my password, go next, save the password, next. So now, because I've got it set up on my account, Google wants me to do 2FA. So this is wholly inside Google. All of this is entirely in Google's domain. So Google then sends me back to the Google sign-in in Facebook, in B2C. B2C validates the token. It goes to step 3, which is another step behind the scenes. And what we're doing is we're reading the user from the directory by whatever ID Google has returned to us. If we don't read back a user, so we still don't have an object ID, then we're creating a user in the directory with that alternative security ID, with the ID that came back from Google or Facebook. So then the next time they sign in, when we read them, we'll get back the user record with an object ID. We won't need to create them again. We don't have to do that. That's entirely optional. We're doing it here because we want to standardize how our relying party is interacting with our users. We want everyone to come back with the same ID in our case. And we also, at some point in the future, want to store that refer information on them. Maybe we could have, as part of this journey, an extra step that we execute to say, if you're coming from a social provider, we show you a page that asks you, which site referred you from. It captures that same information that we're doing during registration. So we capture everything for a social provider that we do for a regular local account. And we can do that conditionally based on the fact that we know it's a social authentication. And then we store it against the directory because we've got a user in the directory. Entirely up to the business logic, the business rules. We could quite happily live without the user in the directory if we didn't need this ID, if we didn't want to store anything against them, if it was just enough to know that they were authenticated by virtue of the fact that they'd been off to Google or Facebook or wherever. And you can see again over here on the claims, tokens largely the same, except for authentication source now, we've set it to be a social authentication. So again, we're just detecting that in B2C, setting that value, and then returning it. We don't have to, that's entirely configurable. We could have multiple different options. So we've got Google, we've got Facebook, we could have LinkedIn. At this point, once we've got this structure in place, it's just a case of adding more in, setting up more technical profiles that define, okay, LinkedIn means we redirect over to LinkedIn to this particular URL. We take these claims once it comes back, it gets validated in a certain way. And at that point, we're just into common logic. We could also have a separate policy. Maybe as part of a user profile management, where we allow users to link or unlink their different Google and Facebook sign-ins. So we're not limited to just having one of these per user. We could have it so that users can sign in using either or both Google and Facebook and associate both of them with their user record, and then provide them profile management features to link and unlink them. So we've been through a few topics there. We've been through single sign-on, we've been through federation, both in terms of things like home realm discovery, federating off to AAD, doing social sign-ons and presenting the user with details. All while we've been clicking around this app, you might have noticed that we've got a new page at the top, this secure page. And what we're going to show now is a custom policy that isn't a sign in or a sign up. It's got wholly custom logic, and how we can use that and custom claims along with a second factor authentication to give users access to a more restricted section of the site. So if I sign on, in fact, I first check out my policies. So if I check out my last set, push them up, and then sign out and sign back in as a staff member. So you'll notice this time I go straight through because AAD keeps its own user session. So we're not making use of B2C's user session there, we're making use of AAD's. So I come off, still do the home realm discovery, it decides that it wants to go to AAD, I get redirected to AAD, AAD records the fact that I've already got a user session going on there, doesn't reprompt me the same as B2C might not, and sends me straight back with a token. Now what we've got here this time though, is this additional claim called LOA, and we've set the value to 2. So what we're saying here that our level of assurance, how sure we are that this user is who they say they are, is 2. which is just a value we've picked for the purposes of this demonstration, but we're using it to indicate that we're more sure that the user is who they say they are because they're a staff member. And our site here that we've written, our OpenID Connect site, is just using that claim to then say, okay, that means because you've got this LOA2, you've got access to this particular page. So our staff members, they come with this because we're setting in our B2C journey. So if I go up to our company sign-in, so where we're pulling all of the claims out, we're now just setting this LOA claim to a value of 2 and then returning it. Our customers, we're not so sure about. So if I sign in as my demo account, so I go in and I get my token as it was before. I don't get this LOA2 claim, and that's because we're fairly sure that this person should be allowed access to the site. We're sure enough to allow them access. We're not sure enough to allow them access to this restricted section. Maybe that's an admin section or provide some sensitive information about the company or something. We want them to have access. We want them to know that it's there, but we don't want them to go through the hassle of proving that they are who they say they are that much every time if they're not going to use it. So what we can do is we can configure our site here so that when we go to this secure page that it knows needs an LOA2, it redirects to B2C to do a different authentication journey. And here we're doing an elevate policy. So this is just another user journey policy that we've set up. We've set it up to extend from our extensions. So this policy that applies across multiple different types of user journey. And we've set up the steps so that step 1, we make sure that the user's in the session. So we read them back. Normally, step 2 would probably be some error handling to say, okay, if they weren't in the session, then block them from continuing. But for the purposes of the demo, we've set aside all that. Step 2 is, given that we've read them from the session, we know that we're only storing their object ID, then just read back their full details because we want a full token at the end of it. Step 3 is, okay, we want to do phone MFA to make the user prove that they are who they say they are. That they don't just know their username and password, but that they've also got a device, their phone, that we can send a one-time passcode to that they can enter to prove, okay, you are who you say you are. And we only want to do that if they've not already done it. So we've just got a little precondition here to say, if it looks like they've already been through that process, don't prompt them again. So the phone MFA journey or technical profile is defined over here, down here. So what we've got set up here is a technical profile that's a phone factor protocol provider. So that just tells B2C, okay, we're dealing with a page that looks like this, that's got a phone number on it, which I've just added to my user record manually in the background. And based on that, you're to send a code or call me, or the user can cancel out, at which point they don't get the token, they don't get access to that section of the site. So in this case, we want to send a code. So B2C, because of the technical profile that we're using, it knows how to send me this code. It knows how to do all the retries and what happens if it goes wrong. It's also got all of the JavaScript on the page that's needed to automatically respond to that code being valid. So it's doing all of the logic to wait for the code to be entered. Once I've entered it, it redirects me into the site, and you'll see now I'm in. I've got a token that looks largely the same as I had before, except now as a customer, I've also got this LOA2 claim because I've successfully been through phone MFA. We've set this LOA2 claim, and then we've generated our token containing all of the other details that we read from our AAD, along with the fact that I've now been authenticated from this elevate policy. And you can see I've now got access to this restricted, this secure page. And because this is now in my token, because it's now on this particular site, I can go to home, I can go back to my secure page. I don't need to go off again. This site, my relying party, is keeping hold of all of those claims, keeping hold of that token, and then it doesn't have to redirect me. We could have as many different ones of those as we wanted. We could do things like user profile as well. That's just another different kind of policy that we'd set up. We can be very flexible about what we can do with the different policies and how they all work. It's just about making our relying party execute those policies, and then respond to the token being returned. In this case, we take the LOA2 claim, and that now gives us access to this secured page. It could return a different set of groups or a set of roles or whatever we wanted our logic to be there. We're entirely in control of it. And that's everything. That's everything that we wanted to cover in the demo, I think. So we went through the single sign-on, we showed how that did session handling, and then some federation, some social sign-on, and finally this multi-factor authentication, this elevation. That technical profile for the multi-factor for the phone, that doesn't just have to be a thing on its own like we've used here. We could make that part of registration. We could make that part of the sign-on if we wanted and automatically give them LOA2 or not. Just say, if you go through our sign-in process, you're good enough to get access to whatever. It's all in our control. We can do basically whatever we need to with these custom policies. And with that, I think it's back to Rob.
All right, thanks, Dave. I think that was really insightful into sort of how to configure SSO and federation for B2C. So let's have a quick summary of what we've covered today. So Dave showed us how to federate sign-in using both a local Active Directory and social via Google. We looked at how single sign-on is configured in B2C and how easy it is to access multiple applications using the same session. We then looked at how sessions are managed in B2C, and finally Dave gave us a demonstration of multi-factor authentication in action. Good, so let's see what questions have been sent in whilst Dave was presenting. So we've had a few that have came in. I think the first one was, could we authenticate across different Active Directories?
Yes, so there's a couple of different ways of doing that. We can either set up different technical profiles. So like we were making a decision there to either go off to our company Active Directory or do a social sign-in, or rather do a local sign-in. There's nothing stopping us from setting up more complicated logic and having multiple different Active Directories that we redirect to. We can also set up B2C to do multi-tenant authentication. So we let the Microsoft end decide which tenant, which directory should this request be accessing. And yeah, both ways are possible. It just depends on what we need our logic to be. Having the more complicated, based on this type of email address or that type of email address, go here, there, or the other place, is probably more applicable where you're accessing multiple different kinds of federation that aren't all Active Directories. If you've got multiple directories you want to talk with, it's probably more likely that you want to use the multi-tenanted way of doing things.
Good. Thanks, Dave. So the next one is around the social sign-in. It's how can I get analytics from sign-in, e.g. Google versus Facebook?
So this is like you want some analytics based on the number of users that are using the Google sign-in versus the Facebook sign-in versus whatever else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we can do there is, like we were detecting that the users used a social provider or a federated provider or a local account, we could be a bit more fine-grained than that. We could have B2C populate claims depending on which option the user goes for to say which one they chose, or as part of doing that actual authentication, have it make an actual call. So either way, we ultimately end up with a bit of information that we can then, within B2C, make an API call to an external system, passing along that bit of information saying either this particular user signed in with this method or just this method was used. And then, you can then use that however you want to, do whatever you want with that API call to build up a picture over time of either these are the sign-ins that we're seeing, so X% come from Google, X% come from Facebook, or maybe we're seeing this many registrations from Facebook or Google and all that kind of things. So it's really about, in the policy, we'd add a bit of data, add a claim to say this particular sign-in method was used, and then add an API call again in the policy to call into some other system. Maybe it's Cosmos, maybe it's, I don't know, Event Hub or something like that. Whatever external system it is, passing along that information. We're going to go through API calls more in a future webinar, so that might come a bit more there, but it's really about just identifying that data in the policy and then passing it along to an API call.
Excellent, thanks. The next one's an interesting one. It's how can I stop one of my customers trying to sign up with a staff email address?
Yep, so you might have seen there. So if I just drop out, because I can probably more easily show this back in here. So if I sign out here and go back to sign in. So if I use my non-staff account, oops, if I can type it right. So you see here we've disabled the ability for them to enter their email address there. And if I do a sign up, we've also disabled it there. So we can do that on the client side. You know, it's just a case of setting up the policy to do that. You can also add logic into the policy so that if the user bypasses this on the client side, because this is just HTML, we've still got logic in there to detect them and then say, no, you're not allowed to progress. That's not an email that you're allowed to sign in with. And we've got complete control over that logic, over the message that gets displayed, you know, of the entire process. So it's just a case of setting up the logic, defining where it should run, and then making sure it gets executed as a validation step.
Excellent, thanks. So yeah, I think that the final question maybe ties into the last one a bit. It's can I do MFA for just certain more VIP users?
Yes, as long as you've got a way of identifying them. So if there's some information that's stored in the directory, for example, or if there's some information that you can read in using an API, then you can pull that in as part of your B2C user journey and then just have a step in there that says, okay, if that data has been pulled in, or if the value of the data that we've pulled in is X, Y, or Z, then show a step that does the MFA. So it's just another conditional step, like we've got a conditional step for our registration. And it could be whatever you want. It doesn't just have to be MFA. Like I say, we're in complete control here. So it could be that certain types of user get prompted for additional information. If we detect that you're the first user signing up for a company, say, maybe we prompt you for more information about the company. Or if we could do progressive profiling, which is something that we've talked about in other webinars, where we allow the registration through pretty much like we've got here, with very little information captured. Maybe you only want to capture email address and password. And then on later sign-ins, we conditionally ask them for more information. Okay, give us your name. If you've signed in a few times, maybe give us some information about your company. It's all just building up these conditional steps inside the user journey, and providing MFA for a particular class of user is just another conditional step in the user journey. It's just a case of identifying where am I going to get the data from that identifies those users, what am I going to do with it, and how is that going to filter into a condition to optionally, you know, execute that MFA step or not.
Great, thank you, Dave. We've had another one come in,
Yep.
and it's just, can you speak to logout?
Can I speak to logout? Yes, B2C supports logout. Is it with yes, so B2C will do single sign out if that's the question. So you might have seen it briefly. So if I flip back again, there's a lot of flipping backwards and forwards here, but never mind. So if I sign in, in fact, let's do it on my dashboard because it's easy to show. So if I sign in over here, I sign in with my usual bits and pieces. So I'm signed into my dashboard. I sign into my OpenID Connect site. So we're now signed into both places. If I sign out of here, then that signs me out of this site. It signs me out of B2C. And the way we've configured it in B2C, B2C is also going to send a sign out request to the endpoints that we've configured for each of our sites. So we've configured an end session endpoint for this site. So when I sign out of here, and the request goes to B2C, B2C goes, okay, I know you signed in there. I know you're also signed in here. So I'll send a request to this site. And if I just click home to refresh, you'll see I've also been signed out of that at the same time I was signed out here. So B2C will propagate the sign out across multiple different providers. It will go wide. It can also go deep. So that might be what that question's talking about, where if I've signed in using my AAD or some other federated provider, can we propagate it up the chain? That's where the more complicated single sign-on session logic comes in, where the different session options come in. that's the kind of thing where if you need to do it, you're probably better off getting in touch with us, and we can kind of be a bit more specific in how we answer that question specifically for that scenario, because there's a whole heap of different things to consider, right? Like if you're doing a social sign-in, the fact that I've signed in with Google, when I sign out of my app here, I don't necessarily want to be signed out of Google, right? But if I'm signed out of my AAD, or rather if I sign in with my AAD, maybe I do, maybe I don't. It's a lot more about what's the user's expectation there, you know, what's the proper design for that journey. So we tend to do that a bit more one-on-one, figure out what's the right way, rather than just saying the technical answer is X, Y, or Z. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Dave. We have had another one that's come in, and it's sort of the opposite to one of the earlier questions. It's, if I federate for my staff, can they impersonate customers?
Yes. Yeah, so there's nothing stopping you creating a custom policy to do that. So like we set up the elevation custom policy to have specific logic in it, we could set up an impersonation custom policy that federates off for staff members, or makes sure that you're signed in as a staff member first, and then does whatever you need your impersonation logic to be, whatever that might be. Yeah, what exactly that does is going to depend on your system, what you want your relying party to do with the token that comes back, how you're identifying the fact that the staff member's impersonating. But the underlying principle is absolutely fine. Yes, there's nothing stopping you doing that. Same policy to do that.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. So, yep, I think that's all of the questions. Thanks very much for those that submit them. If you do think of anything else later on today or later in the week, please feel free to reach out. So, Dave, you just want to go to the next slide. I'll talk about the upcoming webinars that we've got. So in the next B2C session, as David alluded to, we're going to demonstrate how to integrate APIs in B2C. We're also going to look at user migration. So this is taking place on Wednesday, the 6th of January, 2021. As a reminder, we're also running a webinar series on self-sovereign identity, which explores some of the new concepts in identity. The next webinar in the series is using Hyperledger Aries to issue and verify credentials. This is on Wednesday, the 16th of December. It's 2 weeks' time. Again, our previous webinars can be found on our website and our YouTube channel. So finally, thank you very much for joining us today. If you do have any further questions or would like to get in touch, please email us at info@condatis.com. Again, thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.